I'm pleased to welcome you all here today to the second installment of the Open Space Lecture Series, The Future is Now. The Open Space Lecture Series is a partnership of the Scarborough Arts Council and the Center for Creative Communications. And on behalf of the Scarborough Arts Council, I would like to thank Centennial College for hosting this series and this podcast taping. The Open Space Lecture Series will examine the impact of the digital world on our community's history and culture and will be recorded for a podcast. So today you are the live studio audience for this recording of the podcast, which will appear soon on the Centennial College website. So please check back for that to listen to that podcast. I would like to welcome our second speaker in the installment, Stuart J. Murray, who is the assistant professor in the Department of English at Ryerson University. And he will be speaking on the digital revolution of communities and how digital culture is reshaping the way we think about ourselves, our relationship with others, and our shared world. So I would like to take this opportunity to welcome Stuart to the microphone. Thank you.
As Tim said, my talk is digital evolution or revolution of communities, so I'm playing with this idea that evolution and revolution go hand in hand somewhat. And I'll talk a little bit, mostly my work today is drawn from the work of Marshall McLuhan, who's, of course, the great Canadian media theorist who taught at the University of Toronto and died in 1980, so it's a relatively recent figure. You'll see by some of the things that I say, quoting him, that he remains relevant for us today, especially in our technological world and our world of global terrorism as well. So I don't promise a particularly happy talk. This is serious stuff here. Technologies are not straightforward. So my talk today might not be what you'd expect to hear when you come to a lecture series whose title is The Future is Now. But what should you expect? The future is now. This is a strange assertion, a strange thing to say, it seems to me. If the future has already arrived, then we can all pack up and go home. This lecture is over. All of our tomorrows will amount to nothing. There's really nothing to live for. So I'm not quite sure that the future is now in that sense. Of course, you'll tell me that I'm being too literal and I'm reading this in the wrong way, and you'd probably be right there. When we hear the future is now, we are probably meant to imagine a certain image of the future. We're meant to think about progress, I think. The gradual enlightenment of humankind, the eradication of poverty and disease, the end of racism and ethnic violence. In short, we're meant to imagine a sort of New Jerusalem, I think, a utopia of prosperity and human happiness, thanks to the glorious promises of science and technology. Clearly, this future has not yet arrived. But when we hear that the future is now, we are asked to imagine, I think, that this future will arrive, and that what we are doing today, now, is a part of it, that our current science and technology are leading us toward enlightenment, toward prosperity, and toward human happiness. In short, when you hear that the future is now, you might expect a talk that buys into the story of human progress, a talk that uncritically celebrates, maybe, the achievements of science and technology. My talk today will not be quite so optimistic, as you'll find out. Yes, technologies are cool, they're exciting. New technologies mean that we can communicate and work and live together in ways that were unimaginable until recently. But I believe the digital age raises some very serious and new challenges to us as a people and as a human community. After all, new technologies do not just offer us new ways to communicate and to work and to live together, but they offer us new ways, and in creative ways often, to exploit the other, to enslave the other, to kill the other. So technological progress is not always simply good. The world changed forever when the Nazis developed new technologies to kill Jews, Gypsies, Slavs, and homosexuals by the thousands. And the world changed forever with the invention of the atomic bomb and its use. Today we might think on a smaller scale how drug companies test their products in African countries on human beings. And we might think how this is justified in the name of technological progress, perhaps, which usually means that the value of that company's stock is increased, and such increases, of course, forgive a multitude of sins. So, to speak of technological evolution, then, technological progress, is extremely problematic. With all these horrors, is life really getting better? The word evolution, I think, makes us think of Charles Darwin and his work regarding the evolution of species. According to Darwin, if I remember my science classes, and it was a while ago, but according to him, I think species undergo a kind of process of natural selection, and they change over time. Those species that can be said to flourish are the ones that best adapt to their environments. We tend to think of this adaptation as progress. Adaptation that makes an organism more fit for survival will be favored and more likely to be, and those adaptations will be more likely to be passed along to the next generation. There's a kind of biofeedback loop between the organism and its environment. It's almost like a self-improvement program, except there's no self here, really. The progress is not self-conscious. It's completely blind. In fact, it's brutal. The 19th century British poet Alfred Lord Tennyson once wrote that nature is, he said, red in tooth and claw, which means really that I hope that's not my cell phone. You see the interruption of technologies. No, it's not me. Pagers, cell phones, well, with the interruption of technologies. Back to the 19th century poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, who once wrote that nature is red in tooth and claw, which means really that nature is drenched in blood, that the story of natural selection is quite bloody indeed. So I think this is one reason that we're mistaken to use the word evolution when we are discussing technology and technological developments. Humans, us sitting here, we make technology. So technology is in a sense not natural, at least not in the way that Darwin's evolution is natural. I think we need to remember this because we remain responsible for our technologies. We're not responsible for our natures in quite the same way as we are responsible for our technological creations. So to imply that technologies evolve or that they are in any way natural, I think is really dangerous. And to show you why this idea of an evolution of technology is dangerous, you have to think about, again, what Darwin means by evolution. Evolution, he says, is a natural selection that is red in tooth and claw. In other words, for Darwin, evolution has a kind of built-in inevitability. Evolution is driven by a kind of brute necessity, a force. If organisms do not adapt, they will die, they will go extinct. So nature is vicious, but survival is at stake. On the other hand, for technologies, there is no real inevitability. There is no necessity. We have a choice with our technologies, whereas organisms do not have a choice in the question of their survival. Where nature is blind and without moral values, we might say, we are thinking creatures who have moral values. Nature is, to use a scientific term, endogenic. It means that it's driven from inside, from within, by its own kind of logic. On the other hand, humans are exogenic. We're driven by what's outside of us, by our goals, by happiness, by love, by justice, by the future. All of these things that we hope to realize somehow. I think this is why, and this is a play on my title here, but I think this is why human progress is best understood as revolution rather than evolution. We are creatures who revolt. We are creatures who clash with one another because our values are not natural and necessary, but always open to interpretation and to questioning. We clash over what counts as real progress. For instance, does technological superiority of one nation mean that they are more evolved than another? Does their technological superiority give them the moral right to rule over others, to invade other countries, to exploit them, to steal their resources, to enslave them? Here you might begin to see the danger when technology is used to justify a whole set of actions that are taken to be natural or inevitable. Maybe these invasions will be seen as a civilizing mission. If we think of Afghanistan or Iraq and the American and Canadian stance towards them, we've seen as civilizing missions, almost to save them from themselves, because we're invading territories that are so-called underdeveloped, people less evolved or so-called less civilized than we are, as if it were really so simple to equate technological superiority with greater human progress, greater ethical progress, greater social progress, greater political progress, or anything at all. Are we justified then in testing drugs on human beings in Africa because they are somehow less developed or less civilized or less human than we are? These are some of the questions that technology raises but leaves unanswered. Thanks to communication technologies, we're brought face to face with the misery of others in distant parts of the world. They seem to appeal to us directly through our TV and computer screens. Ours is the age of what the Canadian media guru Marshall McLuhan called the global village. This idea of the global village is well known. It's kind of a soundbite, really, that circulates, but it's not so well understood. It suggests that the entire planet is connected through mass communications, and that we live in unbelievable proximity to each other. As that old Bell commercial used to say, we are all connected. And the metaphor of the village here is important. In a village, we know our neighbors. We recognize the faces of others that we pass on the street. We purchase our products from the local marketplace and so on. Whereas in the global village, our neighbors might be remote geographically, but they are present electronically. The faces that we see are the faces that are linked through our Facebook accounts, staring back at us, even if we have never met them in the flesh. And the products that we purchase and consume come from the global marketplace. Plums grown in Peru, moccasins from Mexico perhaps, and computer chips from China. When we speak of the global village, or when people generally speak of the global village, they do so with a gleam in their eye, and with the same excitement for a bright and shiny future as those people who tell you that the future is now. They are what we call techno-optimists, and they are hopeful that we're entering a new age of love and global intimacy. There is almost something religious in the way that they talk. They talk as if they hold the key to our salvation. If you look, you'll see this happening everywhere. So recently I was surfing on a NASA website because I thought, who better than NASA to get excited about the promise of technology? So if you read their website, and I invite you to go to NASA's website, it's fascinating, they'll tell you that technology is being used, and these are their words, to pioneer the future. This idea of a frontier, a pioneer that we need to cross into. To push the envelope, they say. To do what has never been done before. These are cliches, right? I mean, they sound like something from Star Trek. To boldly go where no man has gone before. I think these cliches are reassuring gospel in a world, and they're media gospel. These are cliches that circulate all the time. This is a kind of reassuring gospel in a world that lacks any real reassurance. Technology will save us. It's right there in NASA's mandate, which is described as a vision for the future, they say. Quote, our mandate is to improve life here, to extend life to there, and to find life beyond. If this is not a religious promise, I don't know what is. Such promises make me a little bit nervous. So I'm pointing here, I'm not saying technology is bad. I'm pointing here to a darker, more sinister aspect of technology. And I'm not sure we can call it progress. And I worried very much about calling it evolution because that would naturalize it somehow. What Marshall McLuhan really meant when he spoke of the global village is not always full of hope and optimism. Sometimes McLuhan is full of dread and foreboding. In one of his last published interviews, McLuhan tells us, quote, global village people aren't that much in love with each other. He says, the global village is a place of very arduous interfaces and very abrasive situations. He continues, when people get close together, they get more and more savage, more and more impatient with each other. And this hostility, I think, is a direct result of the new technologies that bring us together and that force us to reevaluate what it means to live together in such proximity. As our communities and their values shift, we are forced to make sense of the social and the political glue that binds us together. McLuhan says that every time that new technologies are introduced, a kind of crisis occurs. This leads to revolution, I would say. And to understand what he means by this crisis that occurs every time a new technology is introduced, I want to take us back for a moment to the first technology that was ever invented, according to McLuhan. I'll tell you a quick story about that first technology. The first technology was the phonetic alphabet, according to McLuhan. The phonetic alphabet is a technology that takes the spoken word and it represents it in visual form, in letters, laying it out in space, preserving it through time, and so on. Before the alphabet, before the phonetic alphabet, or so the story goes, prehistoric or tribal man lived in a direct communion with the world and with others through sound and sight and touch and smell. And with the introduction of the alphabet, we stopped listening and became more visual, detached, linear in our thinking, quantitative, analytic, logical. So the alphabet, according to McLuhan, changed the way that we interact with the world and with others. And it even changed our relationship to time and place. So we no longer have, for example, a direct connection with a tree as oral cultures would have. We have different ways to symbolize a tree instead, through the letters T, R, E, E, which can be written down and preserved, referenced and cross-referenced, passed along, and so on. But the word tree, T-R-E-E, does not look or feel or smell or taste like a tree in any way. You can't climb it. You can't chop it up and build a shelter for yourself out of it. You can't burn it to keep warm in a Canadian winter. McLuhan claims then that the alphabet slowly destroyed our kind of collective communion, our identity, and our sense of belonging in a tribal community. And eventually this collective consciousness, he says, was replaced by individual consciousness, the idea of a distinct and rational self. This idea of the rational self is what it means to belong to a literate culture as opposed to an oral culture. So the shift happened as the alphabet was introduced and we gradually became more literate. So I told you the story of this first technology because I think it helps us to understand what's happening right now. Today, there's another technological revolution going on. It is not because of the alphabet, of course, but it's because of digital technologies. That literate culture, that rational, ego-centered self-culture that gradually replaced oral traditions, as I just told you about, is now itself being replaced by digital culture. We are confronted with new ways of living and relating to one another. So what does this mean? Well, for one thing, it means that we're moving away from that rational, individual, logical, linear self. We're moving away from that self that the phonetic alphabet gave us, that self which is abstract and which doesn't have a relation to a tree but has a relation to the symbol of a tree. In the global village of networked connectivity, then, the identity of each individual, that literate sort of old-fashioned identity, is no longer the most important thing. I think this is really the shocking revolution of the digital age. So when we're chatting with friends online, or when we're sharing or downloading music videos or music, we're acting as just another node in a network, of a vast and interconnected network. This is the digital age. And McLuhan claims that in some ways, the digital age returns us to what he calls a tribal, collective identity without individual consciousness. Others have called this a secondary orality. So if we have the oral stage in a prehistoric man, then we have a literate phase. That in the digital age, we're being connected once again in certain ways that are tribal, in certain ways that have a connection to that original oral culture. So I'll give you one example to start off with here. Think of that concept that belonged to the literate age, the age of the phonetic alphabet, the age of the book, not the age of the screen, the computer, before the digital revolution. I'm talking here about that old-fashioned concept called the author. Once upon a time, we used to think of the author of a book as the source of that book, and the content of that book as something that the author had produced somehow. The author's identity in this model is incredibly important. Why should I trust what I read? Well, perhaps the author is a professor. Don't trust them, but perhaps. Or perhaps the author is some other expert on the subject, and I can verify this. So the identity of this person was very important. Yet, in the digital world today, there's not the same authority, nor is there the same system for verifying the author's identity. In fact, if you think about a Wikipedia entry, for instance, it would be impossible to point to one single author. Wikipedia entries are collaborations from many sources across the planet, around the globe, and there's usually no way to verify the identity or the authority of the people who are writing and rewriting and so on, right? Or take the example of rap music. Blends together mixes from various different artists. Here, there's no one single solitary source of the creation. The music ends up being a collaboration, a mix of various people who are speaking and performing here and there. Their words and music are remixed and packaged, and it's difficult to point again to a single person who is behind this work. It is the work of a community of artists, and of listeners too, as we give them a kind of feedback. Of course, copyright law hates this kind of stuff. It drives them crazy. The RIAA is suing children, of course, for exchanging music. Copyright law is really old-fashioned. It's based on this old-fashioned idea of a single author or a single artist who produces a single product and who owns the rights to that product. Copyright lawyers tell us that it's illegal to share music through LimeWire or Napster. Of course, none of us do that. But for those of you who have grown up online, it is probably the most natural thing in the world to do. Sharing it is just what you do in a network, as a node in a network. And ownership of something on the internet seems to be a very silly concept somehow. So the digital world is really all about the circulation and recirculation of these texts, whether it's a Wikipedia entry, piece of music, a blog entry, or a YouTube video. You can see pretty quickly that there's a clash of the old values, here old legal values, and new values. Today there's a different paradigm that we're growing up in, and the old legal paradigms just don't cut it anymore. In the Globe and Mail this past weekend, I came across an article, a short piece by a University of Toronto professor named Mark Kingwell, a philosopher. And he was writing about the conflict in college classrooms surrounding plagiarism. You all know this old-fashioned rule, right? When we write an essay, we are not supposed to take someone else's ideas and present them as our own. We are supposed to painstakingly document our sources, but this can get out of hand. Are we meant to document every last detail? That seems a bit crazy, because there will be no way for us to remember where all of our ideas came from. Everything we know comes from somewhere, after all. Like the Wikipedia article, our own essays are collaborations from many sources. So let's stop pretending, Kingwell says, that there is any such thing as an original work. Let's give up the idea of the single author, my brain on paper essay, and opt instead, he says, for collaboration and group evaluation. Of course, this is not going to happen anytime soon, but it begins to acknowledge at least that this old-fashioned concept of the single author as the source of his or her essay is a bit of a myth. Once we admit this, though, we are stuck. How else could we evaluate students? The system of essay writing and examination has been around for a long time, and we have not yet begun to imagine the kind of system that would replace it. Something will need to replace it, of course, but until then, there will be a struggle between the old ways and the new ways, the old people and the new people, right? These two different paradigms. So I think it's no surprise then that great shifts in technology will cause revolutions between the old ways of ordering the world and the new ways. This is why the global village is a place of tremendous conflict and violence. McLuhan predicted back in the 70s that our increasing technological connectedness would result in social and political violence. He said that we would become retribalized and increasingly savage in our relations. This is partly because the shift to new ways of ordering the world is traumatic, it's traumatizing. These shifts threaten our identity, he says, and we try to regain that identity through violent assertions of ourselves. The times of great change are times of terrorism, and McLuhan described terrorists and hijackers as people minus identity. He says they're determined to make it somehow, to get coverage, to get noticed. Today's global terrorism is in many ways a product of the mass media. Today, to be somebody is to be on TV. The spectacle must be built into the terrorist act if it's going to be noticed. Beheading videos just come to mind. McLuhan, who died in 1980, predicted that media networks and satellites, quote, will distribute terrorist paranoia around the world in living color to match each accelerating disruptive event. So I think of that second plane smashing into the World Trade Center and how this short video clip has been burned into our collective consciousness. I think of America's truly tribal response to these terrorist attacks, and how McLuhan predicted the end of political democracy and the rise of political leaders who are not literate in that old-fashioned sense, not literate men, but who appeal instead to collective fear, who appeal to quote McLuhan, the collective tribal image and the iconic image of the tribal chieftain. Here I think of George Bush, someone who is barely literate, but who is nevertheless an image, an icon, almost a brand, a tribal chieftain. He signifies wealth, privilege, and power. And if he spoke too well, if he were too literate, he would not have held such a wide emotional appeal post 9/11. So the global village is a place of very terrible fragmentation. And the digital age is the age of tribal consciousness, collective identity, and emotional connectedness. It means the end of privacy, too, and the end of the self as we know it. Let me give you another example of a challenge that arises because of technological advances. This one's from neurology. I like to pick these up from here and there and think about them. In recent years, digital imaging technologies have been so good at capturing images of the brain that the whole old-fashioned legal system is being challenged. In some legal cases in the United States, technologically advanced imaging of the brain has been used as a defense against murder charges. In a nutshell, the story is, neurologists are able to show that there is an increased likelihood of homicidal behavior if certain portions of the brain are physically enlarged. Nobody's exactly saying that brain shape causes murder, no, but it looks like brain shape is an influential factor. So, if this can be proven, is Mr. Smith still responsible for murdering his wife if he has an enlarged portion of a brain? Or is Mr. Smith's brain abnormality responsible for murdering his wife? What would that mean? What would that look like? Does it even make sense to speak in this way? The old-fashioned view, of course, would be that Mr. Smith is a person himself, and that he is the sole rational agent or author of his actions, and that we must hold him and only him accountable and responsible for his actions, much like the old-fashioned view of authorship, that there's a single author who spills all of his brains onto a page when writing an essay or a book. In contrast, the digital view would be that there's no single author, either of a book or of Mr. Smith's actions. In other words, we would have to see Mr. Smith, the person, as a kind of node in a complex neural network, much like the essay writer is a node in a wider network, or we're nodes in a wider network when we're online sharing music. Of course, the problem is that we cannot put Mr. Smith's brain on the stand in a court of law. We cannot punish Mr. Smith's brain for the murder of Mrs. Smith. So you can see how digital imaging technologies are really challenging the old legal system if they're going to admit the science and the developments of science and technology. How else would we proceed if we do not hold Mr. Smith responsible, and yet the technology seems to point us in another direction? So the problem here with the technology is that we're at a crossroads. We've got one foot in the past and one foot in the future, saying the future is now, but we're being pulled apart. The problem is that we're at a crossroads, as I said. The whole legal system still presumes that Mr. Smith is a person, and that he is the sole rational author of his actions, and so on. Just as the education system still assumes that each one of us is the sole author of the essays that we write. And just as the whole system of democratic capitalism, you can see this is starting to get wider and wider, assumes that we are acting rationally and making free and informed choices when we purchase a product. But of course, all advertisers know, every child knows, that this is untrue. They know that we are motivated by factors such as emotion, a sense of collective belonging, prestige, sexual desire sometimes, and a whole bunch of other factors that have nothing to do with the consumer being a single author source of his or her decisions. The problem is, again, once we admit that there is no such person behind our actions, then what? We will still have to overhaul it means that we'll have to overhaul the entire legal system. We will have to overhaul the entire education system. We will have to overhaul the entire political system, and so on. And you can see then that technology invokes a trauma, a huge crisis. These technologies, or technologies such as these in any case, have raised particular questions that can't be answered in the old ways. A new and better system has yet to be invented. And such a system will have to emerge from people like us together here today, paying attention to what is happening today. It's not going to be easy. So I'm at the point in this paper, as I'm writing it and reading it and thinking about it again as I'm going through it, where I get worried, because remember I started and I said I didn't want to admit that our technologies could evolve in Darwin's sense, but it does seem as though certain technologies have a life of their own necessity, their own internal or inner logic, even a kind of inevitability. It seems as if technologies have evolved faster than our ability to understand the implications of these technologies. Take genes, for instance, genetic technologies as another example. I love these, giving you multiple examples to sort of hold on to. It used to be that we went to a doctor to find out what was wrong with us. We might find out that we had a flu or a certain disease and so on. But with the technology of genetic testing on embryos, on anyone in fact, we can find out that the likelihood of developing particular diseases in our lifetime. So in other words, we can statistically predict through genetic tests whether we will develop a particular disease. What do we do with this information? We're not sick anymore, but we're potentially sick. How do we understand our potential sickness? What will this mean to us? So if a woman goes for genetic tests and she discovers that she has a 19% chance of developing breast cancer in her lifetime, what will this number mean to her? It starts sounding like science fiction, like that Tom Cruise film, Minority Report. Or do we tell Mr. Smith that on the basis of the most recent brain imaging technologies that apparently there's a 7% likelihood that he'll kill his wife? Well, how should he act on this information? And how should the woman act with the information of her genetic statistics in breast cancer? How will this woman experience herself? And how will Mr. Smith experience himself? Among other things, I think, they will experience themselves as part of a larger mechanism, part of a network, and not as the sole author of their decisions or actions. It'll be my brain that made me do it. It'll be my genes that caused this disease somehow. I believe that in our culture, we spend a disproportionate amount of time and resources developing our technologies. And I know that I'm saying that here in a place where we're always looking for more money to develop our technologies. So I'll come back to that. So I believe that we're spending a disproportionate amount of time and resources developing our technologies, but nothing about the effects, we're not thinking about the effects of those technologies on our communities. We have to be thoughtful about this, in other words. As McLuhan said, we make our tools, and in turn, our tools make us. We become servo mechanisms of our technologies. In some instances, our technologies control our way of life, and we have lost the ability to control them, our technologies. If this isn't troubling enough, we might consider the extent to which technological control is increasingly concentrated in the hands of corporations, corporations whose values may be completely alienating. A few moments ago, I began by stating that technological progress was the new religion, filling us with sparkling promise for the time to come, the promise that science and technology would lead us toward enlightenment, toward prosperity, and toward human happiness on the horizon. I think we do express a kind of blind and pious faith in technology. Technology will save us. And if this is true, I would add that those corporations I mentioned are the televangelists. Through a vast media network, corporations promote the technologies that they distribute for profit. They create technologies and then create the needs for which that technology is the answer. If this is religion, it's certainly a form of fundamentalism. Why? Well, it's fundamentalism because we're not just forbidden from asking questions, but worse, eventually we will lose the ability to formulate questions at all, I fear. Remember, this is the digital age. We are nodes in a huge global telecommunications network. We are not individual selves, nor are we single authors in the story of our own lives. So, if what I've been saying, of these stories I've been telling you, make any sense, you might be asking, how do we resist this technological fundamentalism without throwing out the baby with the bathwater, without throwing out the technologies themselves? How do we use them for good? And how do I make sense, you might say, of our technological revolution so that I might begin to answer some of these challenges that these technologies pose for us? Well, I see two ways that resistance is happening in the world today, and they're both very disturbing. They're both disastrous. First, there are those who resist technological fundamentalism, as I'd call it. There are those who resist technological fundamentalism by various forms of religious fundamentalism. This kind of clash is seen around the world today, and it is ultimately hopeless because there is no dialogue possible. Fundamentalism really, by definition, prohibits you from asking questions, and worse, it condemns you morally and spiritually for asking questions. Fundamentalism means that you hold to a truth that you take to be fundamental and universal, and no amount of reason will shake this blind faith. The global village will always be a place of arduous interfaces and violence so long as there is fundamentalism, I think. So we must work to find other ways to satisfy the very human needs that fundamentalism answers for people. Number two, so the first problem is another form of fundamentalism. Second, there is a conservative resistance to technological fundamentalism. And I'm not a conservative. I'm not a reactionary. The conservatives will say that we should abandon our technological advances, or at least find a way to understand these technological advances in terms of the old literate value system, which includes the old legal system, the old medical system, and so on. In other words, conservatives tell us that we should return to the idea of the single author, that we should return to the idea of the rational person, ego agent, that we should return to the idea of this individual self who is responsible and free. The problem with this position is that it means we have to abandon some of the insights that science and technology have given us. Take Mr. Smith's brain again. If it is true scientifically that the physical structure of the brain will influence murderous behavior, we cannot just throw out this piece of knowledge because it does not fit existing modes or existing models of the human person or the existing legal system. That's foolish. It means that we have to find new ways to accommodate this knowledge, and this will mean a huge paradigm shift in the years to come. So those are the two ways that I see answering the question of technological fundamentalism and the questions it raises, and I think they're both disastrous. There is then, I think, a third way to resist technological fundamentalism and to try to make sense of our digital world. And I'll end on this here on a note of cautious hope. I don't want to depress you too much. The third way is to accept that we are global villagers, for better or for worse, and with whatever this means, and to work within this new digital paradigm. It does not mean retreating into another form of fundamentalism, no. Nor does it mean regressing into the tried and true values of an earlier time. This single subject self here, the rational single author self, because these are fast becoming obsolete, these systems. In response to rising fundamentalisms everywhere, the task will be to offer other ways to satisfy, as I said, the very human needs that fundamentalism is able to satisfy. And in response to those conservatives who call for a return to the old values, the task will be to offer new values that will honor, rather than undermine, the insights of recent science and technology. These tasks are colossal, but like Darwin's organisms, our survival depends on them. More importantly, they are tasks that none of us can achieve alone. This is crucial. This is absolutely crucial. We aren't these subjects, and we're not these individual single author beings, and we can't imagine that we're going to, alone in some sort of reflective philosophical stance, come up with a solution. That's just not going to happen anymore. Those centuries are long gone. Those are behind us. We must make the most of our distributed intelligence, this collective identity, to try to understand and imagine new ways of living together. It means that we must learn to tap into what McLuhan called the tribal consciousness of our digital age. We must make use of our emerging collective identity, our emotional connectedness, and our creativity. This calls for a revolution in thinking and being. We certainly do not need more technologists and technicians, at least not if they're just technicians that implement without thinking. We need thinkers. We need poets. We need artists who will work together in our network communities to struggle to invent new ways of thinking, new modes of living together, a new politics, a new education system, a new understanding of digital medias, and so on. The corporate televangelists hate the thinkers, they hate the poets, and they hate the artists. We are not rewarded for our thought, for our poetry, or for our art because it questions rather than builds their technocratic empire. But if we are to survive in the global village without exterminating each other, we must find the ways in which thought, poetry, and art will foster an openness that resists fundamentalism and that works creatively toward a new set of values. I'll end here with McLuhan's words. He says, "The function of art is to produce some livable distance. It's to create a space, a livable distance, not to because what fundamentalism does, it collapses meanings. Art opens up meanings. It gives you another way to see." So McLuhan says, the function of art is to produce some livable distance. Without the artist's intervention, McLuhan writes, man merely adapts to his technologies and becomes their servo mechanism. Thank you. I'd be pleased to take questions, comments. I hope I've been provocative a little bit. Anyway, I'm saying it's always been the natural state of things, but we thought it wasn't. We thought in the age of the book, in the literate age, that there were these things called individual selves, and that we were cut off, and that all we had to do was close our mind. And philosophy departments still teach this. Just close your eyes and reflect, and the answers will come to you, just by the light of your own natural reason, as Immanuel Kant said. There's no such thing, I don't think, where if we don't acknowledge that we're all connected and that our lives are dependent on one another in a very real and ethical sense, then we're doomed. There's, no man is an island. Not anymore. Not anymore. So I think there's never been these individual selves, and especially today. And even the philosophers are beginning, although they still hold to their old ways, they're beginning to be forced to acknowledge that, geez, with these new technologies and some brain imaging, for instance, they're forced to sort of think, well, okay, is it the brain that's the source of the person? Is it the body? Is it the genes? I mean, we just seem to be chasing something. No, we're connected. Yeah, so think, for instance, of the images that we've received from cell phone images from Burma that have been about the revolutions in Burma. Many years ago now, but it's still a very good example. The Philippines, the digital technologies, a popular uprising was organized through people's cell phones. These cheap, disposable little things allowed for a kind of collective consciousness, which allowed for a kind of collective political agency, not a single agency, sort of one man against the machine, but a collective consciousness that rose up and overthrew the government. And so not to throw out technologies, these are great. We just have to be really smart in the way that we're using them, and use them against the corporations that give them to us sometimes as well. So mobilizing against the WTO and so on. These sorts of mobilizations happen on the internet, happen through cell phones. MoveOn.org in the States, of course, has raised a lot of money and a lot of awareness about political campaigns and so on. The internet is a marvelous tool. Blogs coming out. I have a colleague who works on Iran, and she said, this is an amazing statistic. The fourth most popular language, the fourth used language on the internet is Farsi, coming from Iran. And you would think that would be, wow. But it's because in Iran and in the Iranian diaspora around the world, people are blogging like crazy. So and especially Iranian women are blogging. So they're telling the stories of them of their lives and so on. This is revolutionary. That there's this connectedness. There's a global community of people that perhaps in their own communities that wouldn't be allowed and so on. So it is exciting when it can be used. When technology can be used that way. So I don't want to be a pessimist. I just want to say we have to be really mindful. And we have to also attack, or at least try to revise those old paradigms that presume that individual subject, that presume a legal system, that is based on the responsibility of a single author, kind of to change our education system to reflect today's reality. Well, that's good. So yeah, I said that the technology might be evolving, it might have its own sort of inner mechanism that's evolving, certainly because corporations are putting money into technology, and there seems to be a thrust towards technology. And not much interest to pay artists and poets, thinkers, to reflect on what the implications of these technologies are. That's why I said it's evolving faster than our sort of collective ability to keep up with it. So, and a third aspect is that those technologies, those people who have control, are teaching us to enjoy our laziness as well, so that it's kind of a reward. McLuhan called this well, he said that watching TV was going on an LSD trip, and then he said, well, he'd never tried LSD, so he doesn't know what he's talking. But he said it's like going on an LSD trip because we become passive receptacles, and he says that it's like a narcotic, and we become unaware of the media as they influence us. And he uses the example of the fish in the fishbowl. He says the fish is the last one to realize that it's swimming in water. Why? Well, because the water is just a pervasive medium, right? All of our media are pervasive. And he's worried about this. He says we need to be aware of them, at least as influencing the way we think and relate to one another. Not that we need to get rid of them, just that we need to be mindful. Otherwise, the control is in the hands of a few. That technology is the cause of the war. Wow. Well, in a lot of ways, technology is the cause of the Gulf Wars, I think. This is maybe getting a little off topic, I'm not sure, but I think if you go back and look at the lead up to the war, these big boys, Rumsfeld and all the big boys with their big toys and big guns, were just looking for any sort of excuse to test out. So in a sense, the technology determined what would happen, and they used any sort of pretense for doing that. Also, wars are very good for the economy, as you know. You create the number one export from the United States is weapons. It's in 2001 statistic that I read was $900 billion, and I'm sure after 9/11 it's gone up. We're arming everybody. We were armed. Well, the Americans were arming Saddam Hussein until he stopped being their friend and became an enemy. They were arming the Taliban against the Russians in the early 80s, and then there's a kind of technological determinism to war, absolutely, and that's being very cynical, but I think the world goes around because the money goes around, and yes, that's it. We need that. We need creativity. We need people who are open to bringing 2 or 3 different things together in new ways to think about new things, and that's yes, you can call that an author. You can call that authorship, but it's not. I don't think it's coming from a single source. I'm happy. I'm happy to stay and to talk as well to those I didn't get to. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just say a couple words here.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Scarborough Arts Council and Centennial College, we'd just like to thank Stuart Murray for coming down and for this very interesting and provocative discussion here. I'm sure it has you all thinking about a lot of things as you leave today. So thank you, Stuart.
Thank you.
And also just a reminder to check out the Centennial College website as the podcast will be up quite soon, and you'll be able to hear all the entire discussion here through podcasts. So thank you.